All right. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar today entitled What Changed, What Matters? Navigating the Latest Vaccine Schedule Updates, where Dr. Tracie Newman will be going over some of the changes to the vaccine schedule that we've seen in the last week. Dr. Newman, a quick intro, is a board-certified pediatrician and an associate professor of practice in the NDSU Department of Public Health, and she is our medical director here at CIRE. Dr. Newman, you can begin.
Thank you, Kylie. And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We've heard from many of you over the past week here at CIRE, just with questions and confusion. I think many people feeling like they're scrambling to kind of make sense of what these new vaccine announcements mean. So our hope is today we can better inform you on just what happened, kind of how we got here, and what it will likely mean for you and your patients going forward. So for starters, just what is going on? If you're wondering this, you're not alone. It's a great question. We are all navigating these real-time changes together. So last week on January 5th, RFK Jr. unilaterally made sweeping changes to the routine vaccination schedule for children in the United States. This change isn't based on new data or any new evidence, but seemingly for political or ideological reasons. He bypassed every scientific and clinical process that we have and that we're used to, including not taking public comment. So we're going to go into further detail on that. But first, let's just take a look at how we got here. A hint of this started at a highly unusual and controversial ACIP meeting last month in December, where the US vaccine recommendations were compared with Denmark's schedule as a potential model. One of the most concerning aspects of this data that was presented is how it frames childhood vaccination almost entirely in terms of raw counts. So they looked at total vaccine doses, total diseases targeted. And this framing mirrors a common claim made by people who are hesitant about vaccines, that children receive 72 or 96 or even more vaccines. And those numbers sound alarming, but they are misleading. So in the United States, by the time a child turns 18, they are recommended vaccines that protect against 17 diseases. Some of these require more than one dose to build immunity, so the total number adds up over time, but really not in the way that these claims suggest. So when we look at our schedule transparently, children receive about 28 doses by age 2, about 35 by age 5, and those include yearly flu shots. Roughly, they get about 54 doses by 18, with about a third of those coming from annual flu vaccines alone. So these larger numbers that circulate, like 72 or more, they inflate this count by a number of ways. Many times they will include every yearly flu and COVID vaccine through the age 18. Some of them count combination vaccines as multiple separate vaccines. So they would count MMR as 3 instead of 1 vaccine. And some of them even include vaccines that we give during pregnancy. So we're going to explore why simply comparing number of doses between countries is really not a scientifically meaningful way to assess vaccine safety or effectiveness. And just to remind ourselves for a little context, children's immune systems are exposed to far more antigens from everyday life than from vaccines. Healthy young kids, especially those in daycare, they can experience 8 to 12 respiratory infections per year. Vaccines don't prevent every illness, but they do target the diseases that are serious and that are most likely to cause hospitalization, long-term complications, disability, or death. So here we see social media messaging from the President of the United States referencing the number of injections. This framing ignores how vaccines are actually delivered today. So our modern immunization schedules, we utilize combo vaccines. For example, currently, a single vaccine in the United States can protect against diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, Hep B, Hib, polio, all in one injection. We give that at 2, 4, and 6 months. So that means 3 shots instead of a dozen separate injections. When we reduce vaccine policy to a tally of doses or even diseases, we lose sight of the real question. So what level of protection is needed in this population within this healthcare system to prevent serious harm? And this messaging is not neutral, right? It implicitly reinforces fear-based narratives rather than evidence-based decision making. And I think it just distracts from what actually matters: disease burden, health system reliability, and outcomes. And while it is true that US children receive more vaccines today than in the past, these contain far fewer antigens. So a major change we had was between the 1980s and 2000s when we shifted from a whole cell pertussis vaccine to an acellular pertussis vaccine. And we've had other advances in protein chemistry and purification. They now make our vaccines safer and purer, and they have also allowed for that development of combination vaccines. So in the late 1980s, early 90s, vaccines for 8 diseases contained over 3,000 bacterial and viral proteins. Today, vaccines protect against 14 diseases with about 150 immunologic components. Even when we include influenza, which adds roughly 11 proteins, the total immunologic load is just much lower than it was decades ago. In December of 2025, it was released that RFK Jr. was expected to make an announcement on children's health. Some HHS sources had indicated that that announcement may involve moving the US vaccine schedule to the Danish schedule. And in January, this was essentially what happened and was put into place. So let's look at what those changes were and how this process was just highly unusual. So RFK Jr. directed the CDC acting director to formally update the US childhood immunization schedule effective immediately. So this reorganizes the childhood schedule into 3 tiers. The first tier on the left here is vaccines that are recommended for all children, and it retains important things like measles, mumps, rubella, diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, polio, Hib, pneumococcal, HPV, which has been reduced to 1 dose, and varicella. But this is just far fewer vaccines than were previously universally recommended. The second tier is now vaccines recommended for high-risk groups only. So this now includes RSV, hepatitis A and B, and meningococcal vaccines. Third tier is called shared clinical decision making. This now encompasses rotavirus, flu, COVID, which had actually been moved to this category in May of last year. And we also see Hep A and B and meningococcal vaccines here. So the CDC will now routinely recommend vaccines for 11 diseases instead of 17. We're going to go further into this, but let's kind of look at how this decision was made. I think it's helpful to ground us in how vaccine approval and recommendations have traditionally worked in the United States. We have an incredibly rigorous system, and it involves 2 related but very different processes. So everything starts with clinical trials. This is where vaccine safety and efficacy are first evaluated. Those data then go to the FDA. Before the FDA makes a decision, the data are reviewed by an independent advisory committee called VRBPAC. So this is a panel of career scientists and vaccine experts who evaluate the manufacturer's data. They advise the FDA on whether a vaccine should be licensed or authorized. FDA approval answers a very specific question. Can this vaccine be used? Essentially, is this vaccine safe and effective enough to be on the market? FDA approval alone does not mean a vaccine automatically becomes part of routine care. That step happens through ACIP. So the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, this is an independent group of medical and public health experts housed at CDC. They review the evidence after FDA approval, and they decide how vaccines should be used in public health praxis. So ACIP recommendations answer questions like who should get this vaccine, at what age, and whether it should be routine for everyone or targeted to specific groups. Once ACIP votes, those recommendations go to the CDC director. If accepted, they're published in MMWR, and they then become official US immunization schedule, and that guides clinical practice, insurance coverage decisions, and state level policies. So historically, vaccines have moved from evidence to expert review to transparent recommendations, and then only go on to widespread public use. ACIP decisions are not based on a single study or a yes or no vote. They follow a highly structured and transparent framework. For example, ACIP uses the GRADE framework. So this is a standardized method for evaluating the quality of evidence, weighing benefits and potential harms of data. They also look closely at epidemiology and population impact, including how common the disease is, how severe it is, who is being hospitalized, and who is most at risk. That population lens is critical because recommendations may differ for infants, older adults, older people, pregnant people, depending in which country you live, for example. Another important component is professional and clinical input. So ACIP recommendations are typically aligned with and reviewed by professional medical organizations, which represent frontline clinicians. And then transparency is a key feature of this process. So these ACIP meetings are public, the evidence tables are published, the votes are recorded, and even the rationale for the decision is documented in the MMWRs. So public input is also considered through open meetings and taking public comment. So with these most recent changes, ACIP was sidelined and bypassed. So recommendations were altered without routine committee review. Changes were issued very rapidly by HHS leadership rather than coming from, scientific work groups within the CDC or ACIP deliberations. We didn't see a transparent evidence to recommendation framework. There was no documented reevaluation of disease burden, hospitalization, mortality trends, or cost effectiveness data. Also noticeable was the lack of involvement from career scientists and professional medical organizations. So for now, ultimately, the FDA approval does still determine if a vaccine can be used, but this usual expert-driven, transparent process for determining how vaccines are used was altered. So let's take a little deeper look at what the Denmark vaccine schedule is. This is a quote taken directly from the HHS press release. The assessment reviewed 20 peer-developed nations and found that the US is a global outlier among developed nations in both the number of diseases addressed in its routine childhood vaccination schedule and the total number of recommended doses, but does not have a higher vaccination rate than such countries. In fact, many peer nations that recommend fewer routine vaccines achieve strong child health outcomes and maintain high vaccine rates through public trust and education rather than mandates. So this decision was justified using comparisons to peer nations. The framing is really powerful. It suggests that the US is this global outlier, that we vaccinate against too many diseases, and that fewer vaccines somehow lead to equally strong or even better, child health outcomes. On its face, that sounds really reasonable. It's simple, it appeals to international norms, and it implies that the problem is not science, but it's our approach. But this framing only works if the comparison itself is accurate and complete. So let's look carefully at what's being compared here and what's being left out. The truth is that across wealthy countries with advanced health systems, childhood immunization schedules show a striking consistency. By early childhood, most high-income nations vaccinate against roughly a dozen to 15 serious pathogens. The US, the UK, France, Germany, many others you can see here all fall well within this range. In fact, I think you could say Denmark is the outlier. So Denmark's schedule reflects a set of choices that were made in a small, highly homogeneous country with centralized healthcare that guarantees universal access to care. They have low baseline prevalence of disease, and they have strong social infrastructure. Those conditions do not apply to the United States, and they can't be extrapolated to make public health decisions. So notably, Denmark's population is around 6 million. The US as a whole has about 343 million people. So the best comparison for the size of Denmark would be the state of Wisconsin, which has approximately 5.9 million people, or maybe even New York City, which has about 8 million people. Comparing the US to Denmark starts to look like an intellectually dishonest strategy to make the US schedule seem bloated. But the most obvious omission in the discussion is the difference between the healthcare systems. So in 2025, aka before these changes, the US recommends vaccination against 17 diseases, like we said, for all kids. Denmark's childhood universal schedule was for 10 diseases. It doesn't include seasonal respiratory illnesses like flu, COVID, and RSV. It also doesn't include Hep A and B, rotavirus, varicella, or meningococcal. In this December ACIP presentation, they also mentioned other countries like Japan and Germany. It just kind of felt like this numerical comparison was treating vaccine schedules like an interchangeable menu, some having more items, some having less. And the implicit message was that more is bad. But the number of diseases included in the schedule is not the metric that matters most to public health. More important metrics include hospitalizations prevented, deaths prevented, disabilities prevented, right? Outbreaks avoided, healthcare costs avoided, and so on. If we just compare peer nations for the number of diseases vaccinated against, Denmark is actually the lowest country on the list. Like we said, Denmark is the smallest country on the list. Remember, it only has about 6 million people. So if we're comparing peer nations, why stop at Denmark? Canada, Australia, and many others listed here have childhood schedules that resemble the US. So the US isn't a high outlier. Denmark is a low outlier. And although Denmark's healthcare system does exceed our own, important facts were ignored, independent of things like the level of hygiene in a home or sanitation throughout the country, or even just general health of the population or access to healthcare. Certain diseases in Denmark, for example, rotavirus, RSV, flu, COVID, will infect virtually all kids by age 10. So every year in Denmark, about 1,200 kids are hospitalized with severe dehydration from rotavirus, and more than 2,800 are hospitalized with pneumonia caused by RSV. If you account for differences in the size of the country, these figures are virtually identical to what we saw in the US before widespread vaccination. So in the US, a rotavirus vaccine recommendation that came out in 2006 has virtually eliminated the 70,000 hospitalizations we previously saw every year. And during this past year, routine recommendations for RSV immunization has reduced those around 80,000 hospitalizations we used to see by 50%. So Denmark tolerates substantially higher hospitalization rates for preventable diseases, where the US prioritizes prevention through immunization. And this difference reflects policy thresholds, not disease severity. So prevention reduces admission in the US. Proactive vaccination strategies materially lower pediatric hospitalizations. When we compare the two vaccine schedule in greater detail, many of the core vaccines are actually the same. So both the US and Denmark include DTaP, polio, Hib, pneumococcal, MMR, HPV, and in recent years, COVID. So these are considered core vaccines targeting diseases that are highly transmissible or potentially severe. Where the schedule differs is mostly due to policy, not safety. So in the interest of time, I'll just highlight a few examples. Hep B, we're going to do a deeper dive in a few slides. Rotavirus is interesting. So the US now vaccinates all infants routinely. Like we said, this prevents tens of thousands of hospitalizations and upwards of 60 deaths annually. Denmark does not include it routinely, just reflecting lower infant hospitalization risk in their population. Hep A, routine in the US, not in Denmark. Denmark actually has a lower endemic risk of hepatitis A, so routine vaccination is not included. Meningococcal, the US preventatively vaccinates adolescents routinely. Denmark actually only vaccinates in response to outbreak risks in like schools or dorms. And then you have things like RSV, flu, and COVID. These are all different, with Denmark only immunizing high-risk groups. So the US adopts broader preventive vaccination to reduce hospitalization and deaths, and Denmark limits or targets their vaccines where disease burden is lower or where cost benefit thresholds differ in their country. And they have just decided to accept a higher preventable morbidity. And the schedules differ, difference reflects how each system, again, how they're balancing disease burden, cost, and public health strategy. It's not reflective of vaccine effectiveness. A recent report analyzed healthcare systems from 11 high-income countries, and the US actually ranked worst overall. This was based on performances across 5 domains. and the US ranked worst in every domain except for care process. So simply transplanting Denmark's immunization schedule to the US would not achieve the same success because the underlying systems that support things like equitable access, timely delivery, and high uptake, they just aren't in place in the United States. Vaccine coverage is not just about the schedule itself. It relies on strong health infrastructure, reduced barrier, and social supports that allow families to follow that schedule reliably. In light of that, what makes this vaccine schedule work in Denmark is everything beneath the surface. Universal health care, 46 weeks of paid parental leave, near universal prenatal screening, centralized medical records, and reliable follow-up. Health officials in Denmark and Germany were actually kind of baffled by the Trump administration's push to emulate their countries. Traditionally, they have looked to the US as a leader for its meticulous process around reviewing and recommending vaccines. The US just has a larger, more diverse population. We have a wide variation in our health status, access to care, geography, language, and even trust in institutions. The US does not have universal health care, so we have insurance coverage, cost sharing, and access to primary care can vary dramatically from family to family. The US also lacks guaranteed paid parental leave. Many parents must return to work within weeks after birth. So this makes it harder to attend multiple well child visits, reschedule missed appointments, etc. Care in the US is fragmented. I think we're all familiar with this. Medical records are not fully centralized. Families frequently move between health systems, so follow-up is just less reliable. And finally, the US enters infancy with worse baseline health metrics than many of our peer countries, including higher rates of preterm birth, maternal morbidity, and infant mortality, and chronic health disparities. So Denmark and Germany, they actually have comprehensive free prenatal care and an infant mortality rate that is about half of the United States. Hep B birth dose is a great example for comparing the two systems. So Denmark's Hep B strategy, again, works because the system beneath it works. Nearly all pregnant women there are screened, records are centralized, follow-up for both mother and infant is reliable, and that allows Denmark to safely vaccinate only infants known to be at risk. And because of that, their actual disease burden remains low in the country. The US does not have that level of reliability. Between 12 to 18% of pregnant people are not tested for Hep B, and only about 35% of positives actually get follow-up care. Babies are exposed after birth by household members, friends, caregivers who may not know that they're carrying the virus. Before our universal birth dose recommendations, thousands of US infants were infected each year. This universal Hep B birth dose exists not because the vaccine is different, but because the system is. And proposals to delay or limit this birth dose assume the prenatal systems are reliable enough to catch all at-risk infants. But there's no evidence that we have that. And waiting until 2 months of age ignores safety and outcomes, and delaying this may leave many infants unprotected during a window when they're just highly vulnerable. So the US birth dose is not about over-vaccination. It's about compensating for a system that has gaps that infants can't control. And even though testing all mothers during pregnancy is recommended, this testing is not absolute. In many cases, the virus can pass from mom to baby during birth, even when a mother doesn't know she's infected. Other times, babies are exposed, like we said, after birth. This is a highly infectious virus. Many people don't feel sick. They had no idea that they're even carrying this virus. And the Hep B birth dose, therefore, just provides this clinical safety net. It protects babies immediately before they leave the hospital, helps prevent a lifelong infection. And we have data that indicates this really makes a difference. So this figure shows the number of US Hep B cases from 1980 through 2022, overlaid with key vaccination policy milestones. In the early 1980s, annual cases were consistently above 20,000. We peaked around nearly 26,000. Some of our initial strategies, like risk-based vaccination in 82 and targeted infant vaccination with HBIG in 87, these really only had modest impact. you can appreciate the most dramatic decline begins after 1991 when universal infant vaccination was introduced. Cases fell by more than half within a few years. And then multiple later updates have helped sustain low case counts, meaning that the US incidence has remained at a fraction of the pre-vaccination peak. So since 1980, more than 1 billion doses have been administered. Prior to the universal infant vaccination recommendation in 91, nearly 8,000 children in the US were infected with Hep B each year before age 10, and half were infected during childbirth. With the universal birth dose and infant vaccination, childhood Hep B infections have decreased by 95%. Okay, so what does the US schedule look like now? I showed you a little bit. We'll look at a little greater detail. So this is how things have changed as of January 2026. Most of the core vaccines, like we said, MMR, polio, DTaP, Hib, etc., those have all remained routinely recommended for everyone. What's new is how some of these vaccines are categorized. So HPV is now recommended as a single dose, which we're going to look at. Several vaccines, including flu, COVID, rotavirus, Hep A and B, and meningococcal vaccines, have moved from the universal recommendation to risk-based or shared clinical decision-making. RSV prevention remains recommended for infants at higher risk and for babies whose mothers don't receive a maternal RSV vaccine. So the key takeaway is that vaccines weren't removed. Provider counseling and individual decision-making just now play a much larger role. And just to remind ourselves that timing matters. So the previous US schedule was designed to protect children before peak exposure and when immune responses were optimal. It's practical. The doses aligned with routine well child visits to improve adherence. So delaying or spacing vaccines is not safer, and it does not improve immune response. The American Academy of Pediatric vaccine schedule remains science-based. This came from rigorous clinical and safety evidence over many years, and it's designed around when children are most vulnerable to severe diseases. I think this schedule really reflects decades of data on safety and effectiveness and real-world outcomes in US kids. So many pediatric and healthcare providers will continue to follow the AAP schedule, which I believe is reasonable. Is this even legal? A common question we've been getting. So as we said, the Trump administration circumvented the usual process for updating this schedule, which normally involved input from scientific experts, public health leaders, and many other stakeholders. I would say this is gray area. The vaccination schedule can be changed via directive from the HHS secretary without going through ACIP, but that's rare and highly unusual. So precedent for this was actually set in May last year with changes that were made to the pediatric and pregnancy COVID-19 vaccine schedule. There is an 80-year-old law called the Administrative Procedures Act that requires that federal officials follow an open and deliberative process when issuing rules and regulation. So that law forbids federal officials from making decisions that are arbitrary and capricious. The AAP has already actually filed a lawsuit against Kennedy in July, claiming that he violated this APA when he issued a directive around those COVID vaccines. And then just a lot of this is dictated at the state level. So state vaccine mandates that reference CDC schedules generally remain in effect unless states explicitly amend them. Federal changes alone don't automatically alter state requirements. So every state in the United States has requirements for children to enter daycare or attend school. And so far, at least, it appears that will not change. Many states, both blue and red, have said there isn't a strong interest in changing things. So unless a governor of a state intervened, I mean, in theory, a governor could direct their state health department to change the vaccine requirements for schools, for example. But it's believed that that's unlikely to happen. And honestly, such a governor would likely have a fight on their hands. So even with all the anti-vaccine sentiments that we hear, vaccines remain really popular with most Americans, particularly childhood vaccination. There's actually strong bipartisan support for that. And in states where people have proposed making changes, it's not always gone well. Okay, that was legality. Let's look at briefly at the problems with the HPV vaccine recommendations specifically. I think we can acknowledge there's growing high quality evidence that a single dose of HPV does provide strong protection against 16 and 18, which caused most cervical cancers. So, a large trial of over 20,000 participants showed that one dose was non inferior to two, with about 97% effectiveness. So, great news for cervical cancer. And actually, globally, 89 countries currently recommend one dose series, but many countries do still use the two-dose HPV schedule. So, once again, the number of doses seems to matter less than the system that's delivering it. So, countries like the UK and Australia, who've had some success with this, have universal health care, they have centralized records, some of them have school-based vaccination, and national cancer surveillance. So a key difference too is the age of initiation. A majority of countries allow HPV vaccination to start at age 9. Many medical organizations encourage that as well. That can bring several benefits. So stronger immunity when given younger, higher completion rates, prophylactic protection, easier conversations with parents. It reduces the number of injections given to older adolescents, etc. This RFK Junior schedule recommends one dose of HPV be given at age 11, not 9. And as we've discussed, I think the context really determines the risk, not just the dose. The US healthcare system, unfortunately, is fragmented. This makes follow-up, equity, and long-term cancer prevention just more challenging compared to these other countries that have centralized vaccination programs. Reducing the HPV vaccine to one dose will likely still have good protection against cervical cancer. A key question that remains for many people is, does one dose provide adequate protection beyond cervical cancer? There's some studies showing that immunogenicity is variable. Around 1 in 4 may not mount antibodies to key strains after a single dose. Around 20% lack detectable antibodies to HPV-6. So that's a strain that causes oral pharyngeal cancers and a condition called recurrent respiratory papillomatosis. Durability is promising, but actually limited. Our longest follow-up currently is about 5 years. So one dose shows benefit, but for non-cervical outcomes and long-term protection, 2 doses remains the more reliable and standard, I think, pending longer-term data. So again, some important questions just remain. How long will this protection last? And whether one dose protects as well against HPV-related diseases like head and neck cancers and even genital warts. While simply reducing this to one dose, it could improve access. Major medical organizations are concerned about how this policy change was made and actually continue to recommend completing the full vaccine series. The science is definitely evolving, but expert review and evidence-based process still matter. The category of shared clinical decision making, we've got a lot of questions about this as well. This does have a legitimate history. So I think understanding how it has been repurposed requires understanding what it's designed for and kind of what it's being turned into. So this emerged as a recommendation category around 2015, initially for MenB vaccines in adolescents. This is for situations of genuine clinical equipoise. So these are cases where individual factors meaningfully shift the risk-benefit assessment and population-level benefit is uncertain. I think the clearest example is HPV vaccination in adults 27 to 45. ACIP placed this in this category in 2019. So by that age, most people have already been exposed to HPV. The vaccine effectiveness is lower, but some individuals, say someone entering a new sexual partnership after a divorce, for example, who was never vaccinated, might still derive significant benefit. For that population, a blanket recommendation makes little sense, but foreclosing, access entirely would harm the subset who could benefit. So shared clinical decision-making threads that needle. The vaccine remains available and covered, but the default shifts from vaccinate to discuss. And the CDC definition, ACIP defines shared clinical decision-making, this was from their webpage on January 7th, as individual-based and informed by a decision process between the healthcare provider and the patient or parent guardian. Further, they go on to state, Unlike routine catch-up and risk-based recommendations, shared clinical decision-making is recommended for everyone in a particular, is not recommended for everyone in a particular age group or everyone in an identifiable risk group. So CDC defines a healthcare provider as anyone who provides or administered vaccines, primary care physician specialists, PAs, NPs, RNs, and pharmacists. So this change is not just a semantic reorganization of the schedule. It alters how recommendations function in real clinical settings. Routine recommendations establish the default. They trigger automatic prompts in electronic health records. They guide when and how providers raise vaccines during visits. They signal where the weight of the evidence lies. They also enable standing orders, which allow our nurses and pharmacists to vaccinate without patient-specific physician orders. When vaccines move out of the routine category, those defaults weaken. So even if coverage technically remains, the practical effect is fewer prompts, fewer proactive conversations, and just more missed opportunities. The impact of this shift will not be uniform. So clinics and health systems and states are now left to decide how to operationalize shared clinical decision-making. So that includes determining who is authorized to initiate these conversations, what documentation is required, and under what circumstances vaccination proceeds. So in other words, this change pushes complex policy decisions downstream to our frontline systems and providers. Okay, so we're introducing variability, administrative burden for sure, and the friction into workflows that previously just relied on clear routine guidance. And the research on this is consistent. Shared clinical decision-making recommendations correlate with lower uptake than routine recommendations. When you move a vaccine out of the routine category, you strip away the infrastructure that makes vaccination possible in a busy, fragmented healthcare system. A shared clinical decision-making recommendation can make patient-provider communications about vaccines even more complex. This is going to require increased time and resources from providers as they balance the need to provide comprehensive patient education with limited consultation time, resource constraints, diverse cultural beliefs, varying health literacy levels, and increasing widespread dissemination of misinformation and mistrust in vaccines. It's important to be very clear about what shared clinical decision-making actually does and doesn't do. So this does not prevent clinics, pharmacies, or public health departments from giving vaccines. Vaccines can still be administered under standing orders and established protocols. So qualified vaccinators can assess eligibility, they can have the shared clinical decision-making conversation and vaccinate without requiring a one-time physician order for each patient. That may vary state by state, but as a general rule, it does become important for the vaccinator to engage in a documented risk versus benefit discussion within their scope of practice. So pharmacists in particular are already recognized as qualified people to do this. Again, there may be some variation depending on where you practice. Where we could see this matter more is not immediate access, but longer-term supply and availability. So when a vaccine moves from a routine recommendation to shared decision-making, demand becomes harder to predict. And that uncertainty affects whether clinics and pharmacies choose to stock certain vaccines, especially higher cost products. And then from an operational standpoint, providers have to consider, will patients want this vaccine often enough to justify ordering it? Can we manage inventory, cold storage, and expiration risk? And will reimbursement cover both the vaccine cost and the additional time needed for these conversations? Such decisions can disproportionately affect smaller clinics, rural pharmacies, and public health sites that already have tighter margins. And so over time, this can mean fewer locations carrying certain vaccines, even though they're still recommended and still covered. Importantly, what does the US public think that shared clinical decision-making is? Well, 25% of them think it means talking to family. 68% of adults understand that this should mean they review their or their child's medical history with their healthcare provider for any vaccine. 1 in 5, about 25 or 22%, believe shared clinical decision-making means taking the vaccine may not be a good idea for everyone, but would benefit some. And then more than 1 in 10 Americans are not even sure what shared clinical decision making means. I think many Americans are also confused about which healthcare providers can actually engage in this. Most people chose a physician as being the only one allowed to do that when they were polled. How about insurance complication or implications, maybe complications? Will insurance cover these vaccines even if they aren't on the schedule? The short answer is yes for now. The administration has said that all vaccinations covered by federal insurance programs, so our Medicaid, CHIP, and vaccines for children remain covered. And private insurance companies have also said they will continue coverage at least through 2026. Whether this continues long term is uncertain, but for now, children's vaccines are covered at no cost, even if they're not high risk. One exception in the future might be HPV. So if a child is getting 2 doses, the second dose will likely not be covered under this new directive. Little more context on that. If the HPV series is redefined as a single dose, insurers can reasonably conclude that the series is complete after 1 dose. So that means a second dose is no longer guaranteed coverage. It becomes optional or non-standard or clinician discretionary. And once that happens, families may be asked to pay out of pocket. The current commercial price for 1 dose of HPV is over $300. But through the end of 2026, again, health insurance have pledged to continue covering this, covering all recommended vaccines in the prior US schedule. So that's exciting. This is a statement put out by America's Health Insurance Plans, basically just confirming this. What about the future? Right now, like we said, vaccines remain covered. However, the key issue is what happens next. And I know there's many questions around this. In the US, vaccine coverage is tightly linked to the CDC routine recommendations. When a vaccine is shifted to shared clinical decision making or high risk only, insurers may begin to question whether that vaccine should still be covered without cost sharing. So even small changes in recommendation language have major downstream effects. Even if vaccines technically remain available, this shift could lead to higher out-of-pocket costs, uneven coverage depending on insurance plans or state, and then of course just widening disparities, particularly for low-income, rural, or under or uninsured people. Programs like VFC rely on clear, stable recommendations to ensure equitable access. There's also a real communication impact. So when vaccines are no longer routinely recommended, many parents interpret that as meaning the vaccine is less safe or less effective or no longer necessary, even though the underlying science has not changed. We all know this just fuels confusion and doubt for families. And then for clinicians and hospitals, this creates a little bit of chaos, right? Uncertainty about reimbursement, increased documentation burdens, and just longer vaccine conversations than we're all already having in our time constraint visits. So in the long term, these changes can influence insurance coverage decisions, even school immunization requirements, liability considerations, and vaccine manufacturing and supply. I think a downstream impact that often is overlooked is how vaccine schedule changes influence whether manufacturers continue to make vaccines in the US market. So vaccine manufacturing depends on stable, predictable demand. When vaccines are routinely recommended, manufacturers can reasonably anticipate uptake. They can rely on insurance coverage and long-term use. When those recommendations are limited, demand becomes uncertain. And that uncertainty matters. If fewer people are expected to receive a vaccine, manufacturers may scale back production, delay investments, or decide the US market is just no longer viable, especially for vaccines that are expensive to produce or that have lower profit margins. So over time, this can mean fewer manufacturers participating in the US market, leaving clinicians and patients with fewer options. Fewer manufacturers also just means greater vulnerability to shortages, disruptions, or delays, even if only one supplier exists. So this doesn't affect new vaccines. Also, it can impact our existing vaccines. So routine recommendations don't just guide us as clinicians, they support the entire vaccine ecosystem. Let's quickly return to this gold standard of research. Again, this is taken directly from the HHA's press release. They really talked a lot about this. The accepted recommendations recognize that there is a need for more and better gold standard science, including placebo-controlled randomized trials and long-term observational studies to better characterize vaccine benefits, risks, and outcomes. HHS agencies are called on to fund this gold standard science for all vaccines on the schedule. Let's take a step back and just look at the rigorous process of how a vaccine is developed. Traditionally, vaccine development is a long, complex process, often lasting 10 to 15 years. Rotavirus vaccine took 26 years. So this process begins with an exploratory phase, which typically takes 2 to 4 years. This basically involves basic lab science. So this is designed to look at synthetic antigens that might help prevent a disease. Next, we have preclinical studies. These typically involve animal testing to assess safety and immunogenicity. This gives researchers an idea of cellular responses, safe starting doses, as well as safe methods for administration. Many candidate vaccines never progress beyond this stage, mostly because they fail to produce the desired immune response. But the preclinical stages often last 1 to 2 years. If those results are promising, the pharmaceutical company will then submit what's called an investigational new drug application to the FDA. If the FDA gives approval, clinical trials can start. The vaccine is now subject to 3 phases of testing. Phase 1 looks at safety and immunogenicity in a small number of people. If you have promising results, you can go on to phase 2. That involves dose ranging studies in hundreds of subjects. And then finally, phase 3 is the large trial, including thousands to tens of thousands of people. These phase 3 tests are randomized and double-blinded and involve the experimental vaccine being generally tested against a placebo. We're going to get more into this in the next few slides, but the goal of this phase is to assess vaccine safety and efficacy in a large group of people. If phase 3 trial is successful, the vaccine developer can submit a biological license application for approval from the FDA. The FDA then reviews this for several months in a transparent fashion. And if they give approval, then the company will typically begin manufacturing their vaccines. So there are several valid options when choosing a placebo. Saline solution is often used because it has the same osmotic pressure as human tissue fluids and blood. The polio vaccine is one of our more famous vaccine studies of all time. This administered a saline placebo to the control group. You can also use what's called a vaccine minus antigen control. So this would give like the adjuvant only. Using an adjuvant-only control helps distinguish side effects from the immune-stimulating component versus just the active antigen. So during large polio vaccine trials in the 1950s, some children from the placebo group got polio and died. Today, ethical standards have evolved. No child in a vaccine trial goes unprotected without a very clear scientific and ethical reason. So that's why comparison groups may use an existing vaccine instead of saline. It's still rigorous science and it keeps kids safer. So history has taught us you can't ethically run placebo-controlled trials on vaccines that already are known to work and that are the standard of care. Withholding a proven vaccine from children in a control group violates something called the Declaration of Helsinki, which is one of the foundational documents in medical ethics, especially relevant to human research, including vaccine trials. A key point in vaccine ethics is when a placebo, often saline, is acceptable. The Declaration of Helsinki states that the benefits, risks, and burdens and effectiveness of a new intervention must be tested against those of the best proven intervention, except in specific circumstances where no proven intervention exists. So the implication here is placebo use is ethically acceptable when no effective vaccine exists. Once we have an effective vaccine, it's generally considered unethical to use a placebo instead of the proven vaccine, unless there's just really compelling scientific reasons to do so, and the participants in the study are fully informed. So for your reference, this just looks at the history of this in much greater detail. We just referenced the Salk polio vaccine trial. I think in the interest of time, I won't go through each of these, but all the way from the polio trials in the 50s to our modern pertussis innovations, These examples just show clear principles. Childhood vaccinations have consistently been tested through rigorous controlled trials. Placebos are used when it's ethically justified, often when there's no effective vaccine. Once a proven vaccine exists and is available, the trials shift to comparative controls to answer new scientific questions, which is the standard of care. So to put it all together, this kind of lays out how vaccine testing typically progresses. Essentially, new technologies start with the most basic comparison, so saline, placebos. Proven platforms build on established safety data, and ethics and science work together to protect both study participants and future vaccine recipients. There's also just multiple layers of safety monitoring that continue long after vaccines are approved. This system has evolved over 70 years, and it has really just produced vaccines that are among the most thoroughly tested medical interventions in history. This is a quote from Dr. Sean O'Leary of the AAP. He's the chair of the Infectious Disease Committee. He said, the way vaccines are studied in the US is considered by most health organizations across the world as the gold standard of care. To require current approved vaccines to be re-examined is unnecessary, unethical, and will only lead to the suffering and death of more children from vaccine preventable diseases. And just to remind us as we enter, vaccines save lives. That's just really undisputable. They're considered the most, greatest public health achievement of the 20th century. In a landmark study published in the Lancet, they found that global immunization efforts have saved an estimated 154 million lives over the past 50 years. That's equivalent to 6 lives saved every minute of every year. The majority of those lives are infants. So just for perspective, during our hour here together during this lecture, vaccines will save about 360 lives. Pretty impressive scale of impact. And before we had vaccines or they were introduced, these diseases were just a constant presence in our clinical practice and public health. You can see here, every year in the United States, we saw hundreds of thousands of measles cases, tens of thousands of diphtheria, mumps, and so on. We also would see countless hospitalization and deaths from these. So slides like this are just a reminder of what uncontrolled infectious disease looks like before vaccines fundamentally changed our landscape. So now when we look at the same diseases in the modern era, again, you can appreciate nearly every vaccine preventable disease has declined by more than 90%, many over 99%. Vaccines have not only reduced morbidity and mortality, it's fundamentally changed what providers in the United States see in their daily practice. And just to highlight, these are the ones with newly altered recommendations. Are these levels of annual morbidity really something that we want to return to? It's important for us to acknowledge why the US childhood vaccine schedule works. For more than 30 years, it's just given us measurable results. So hundreds of millions of illnesses have been prevented in the United States, millions of hospitalizations avoided, and over 1 million lives saved. The American schedule was designed around US specific disease risks, and it's paired with access through programs like VFC. And it's also just highly cost effective. So adapting a Denmark-like schedule means no longer routinely protecting US kids against diseases that still cause harm here. The goal isn't fewer vaccines. The goal is the right vaccines for the right diseases in the right population. Denmark's childhood vaccine schedule is not a gold standard. It's a policy choice that was shaped by unique national circumstances to Denmark. And we're now seeing vaccine preventable diseases return. We continue to have falling coverage rates for many of our vaccines. CDC data show that outpatient visits for influenza-like illness are the highest they've been in 30 years. There have been 17 pediatric deaths so far this season for influenza. Last season, we had a recent late report bringing that tally to 289 pediatric deaths. That's the highest on record since CDC started tracking. Measles cases have surpassed other milestones. We had more cases in 2025 than any year since 1991. We are at risk of losing the US elimination status that was established in 2000. That's supposed to be reevaluated later this month. So stay tuned. But I think changing the schedule at this moment doesn't correct a problem. It really compounds it. And just to remind us that smallpox was a highly contagious, devastating disease, something I teach about in my course. It caused many physical and mental problems, carried a substantially high fatality rate, upwards of 30%. Just really infectious disease. And the smallpox vaccine led to the eradication of smallpox in 1980. So this is kind of our ultimate vaccination story. This disease has literally been eradicated from the planet. Decades of research and real world experience just demonstrate that the existing vaccine schedule protects kids and communities effectively. There's been no major new studies or evidence suggesting that delaying or changing this vaccine schedule improves safety or outcomes. And again, there's always a kernel of truth here. So it is true that the former US schedule aimed to prevent slightly more diseases than many countries, but the difference was small, and many nations with strong health systems were alongside us. This now pared down US schedule protects against fewer diseases than all but one of the peer countries, which is Denmark. And even Denmark is actively considering adding vaccines back, like varicella. So these diseases are rare in the United States because we vaccinate. When we stop using vaccines broadly, diseases come back, and there's really just no ambiguity about that. Recent polling indicates that only 1 in 4 Americans believe the current administration vaccine recommendations were based on science and evidence and facts. This was actually from last September at a point when they were looking at reevaluating COVID vaccines. But I think as healthcare professionals, our role is really to listen to these concerns and try to provide clear science-based guidance without getting into political debates. Science isn't about absolutes. Even the strongest evidence can change as new data emerge. As providers, we make recommendations based on the best available evidence at the time. I think being open with patients about what we know and where there's uncertainty actually strengthens trust. It shows honesty and respect for your patient's ability to understand risk. By communicating thoughtfully, we empower patients to make informed decisions while maintaining our credibility as reliable sources of guidance. And doctors do remain the most trusted source of vaccine information among the US public. 83% say they trust their doctor and healthcare provider a great deal or a fair amount. You can see majority still trust the AMA and AAP. Fewer adults trust the CDC and their state governments. And RFK Jr., an attorney by trade, is trusted only by 35% for reliable vaccine information. Notably, when they do these polls, fewer than half of adults say they trust any of these sources a great deal. So my question is always kind of like, who are you trusting then? More good news to end here. We are almost at time. New CPT codes allow billing for immunization counseling even when vaccines aren't given that visit. This went into effect January 1st of this year. You can see these codes are time-based. So you just need to document that vaccines were discussed, the counseling that was provided, and then why the vaccine was declined. These changes in the childhood immunization schedule are happening quickly, and they're not driven by new safety or updated evidence. Major medical organizations still support the previous schedule and the usual process for evaluating and updating recommendations. Parents and clinicians are going to be confused by these changes, and unfortunately, that confusion seems to be part of the goal. While coverage and access are expected to remain mostly stable through 2026, the future beyond that is uncertain, and differences in implementation will be felt at state, health system, and community levels. And these are not abstract issues. Children's health is at stake. We're seeing a rise in vaccine preventable diseases in the US, and more children are dying as a result. Legal challenges to these changes are likely, so it's important to remember that states, not federal government, set school vaccination requirements. The impact may vary widely depending on where families live. So these are challenging times with schedule changes, coverage questions, and new guidance, coming everywhere. Families look to you to make sense of it all, and that's no small task. Thank you for the work you do every day. Your time, your patience, and your dedication truly matters. Your guidance is critical. A clear recommendation from you often decides whether a child gets vaccinated. By following the evidence and the science, you help make families make safe, informed decisions. Even small conversations, answering a question, explaining a change, just reassuring a parent can make a huge difference. Your recommendations matter, even when they feel like they don't. Your expertise, empathy, and dedication really do protect kids, families, and communities. So I just want to give a really big shout out to my team. We quickly put this presentation together in under a week, and they did an amazing job, in particular, Lauren. So with that, I am happy to entertain discussion. I know we're right at time, or take any questions, Kylie.
All right, Dr. Newman, first question for you. So, given the landscape change and the denouncing of ACIP by many providers, in your opinion, which medical organizations will be most critical to follow for proper guidance?
Yeah, great question. And I think Siri as a whole could probably answer. It's many people we've collaborated with. So I think validated medical organization groups. So for example, we referenced the American Academy of Pediatrics. They still remain in very grounded, scientific, rigorous, transparent processes about making these decisions. ACOG for pregnancy vaccines, the Infectious Society, I always say that wrong, ISDA. And there's other independent groups that have entered this landscape, which I have been looking to. So the Vaccine Integrity Project is a group out of the University of Minnesota, actually spearheaded by Dr. Mike Osterholm, and they have many high-level former vaccine experts, and they are independently review vaccine recommendations and put out guidance. So I think they're a clear science-based, evidence-based group. I know at CIRE we follow people like your local epidemiologist. Kylie, am I forgetting a few others?
There are so many, and we even thought about putting together a list for people on some of the references and sources that we choose to follow. I can't remember if you said Tracie, but if you're a family physician, AAFP would be good. If you're a OB or in the OB space, like ACOG is a great one to follow. So those professional organizations that align with your scope of work. All right, let's see here, Tracie. Another question. Do you think this new guidance creates barriers or problems for schools? Schools will want to continue to ask about vaccine status in the case of an outbreak, especially in order to manage risk and provide the best care for students and staff.
Yeah, another great question. This was top of mind for many people when this was announced. As we discussed in the slides, and Kylie, please feel free to add more to this if you would like, but most of the school, actually all of the school mandates and recommendations are state level. And so, for example, I can speak for our home state in North Dakota. The way the Century Code is written is that it follows CDC recommendations or state health department recommendations. So usually there's some leeway in that. It'll be interesting to see what happens going forward. But kind of as I was referencing on one of our slides, it's our understanding currently there isn't a big appetite to do this. Most states would have to very publicly go in and amend their constitution or amend the way things are written, which often requires a governor intervening at that level. We have not heard that that is happening in any way. I'm not sure, Kylie, if you want to say more on the system approach there.
Yeah, I would say, knowing that we have representation on this webinar from across the United States, just to look for communication from your state immunization unit. If you're asking for further guidance, I know in North Dakota nothing has changed, and if there were changes, that would come directly from our immunization program. And I think that would also happen in states across the U.S. So look for that communication if anything is changing. Yeah. Okay, next one. How do you recommend providers document reasons for giving vaccines for the high-risk group, entered clinical decision-making group to ensure it's covered by insurance? So how would you recommend documenting that, Tracie?
Okay, you're asking for both groups. I think just clearly including in your record, what makes that patient high risk. So including pertinent past medical history or problem lists, which of course you would do in any of your standardized notes. And then just clearly documenting, even if you make a dot phrase or a brief thing, that the risk versus benefits for that individual patient and their health circumstances was covered in that visit. And then documenting what the parent chose, even if it was to not to accept the vaccine, and maybe a line or two of why that they chose not to. I think it's that simple.
Okay. we threw this one in at the end and we knew people would be interested in it, that coding information for vaccine counseling. Someone's wondering if you know whether registered nurses qualify as a qualified healthcare professional when coding for vaccine counseling. Do you know, Tracy?
That I don't know. It
Okay.
might be, I know this came out for physicians, but I guess maybe check with your nursing organizations or even your healthcare organization that you work for. I can go back to that slide if that's helpful. Because I do think this has been an important change, but I don't want to misspeak on behalf of nurses. I only know my own profession, so I apologize. This was really heavily promoted by the American Academy of Pediatrics. So I'm tempted to say it is for pediatricians and other providers, but don't quote me on that.
Okay. All right, let's hear. I know it's 104. So let's see, maybe I'll get like one or two more in here. Um, I'm trying to decide. There's so many really good ones in here.
Actually,
Maybe,
I'm just looking at our own slide. Sorry, it says
yeah.
counseling by physician or other qualified health provider. So if you remember that slide, the CDC listed RNs as a qualified. Yeah, I think it might. It's probably worth looking into.
Um,
Sorry.
the, no, no, that's just fine. This is great, and I'm glad that we can answer that question for that individual. This is a question I know that we talked about when we were planning for this webinar, so I'm gonna maybe more generalize it, but as a clinic or a health system, um, how might they determine whether they have to follow CDC guidelines, whether they're going to follow AAP guidelines? What are maybe some considerations there, Tracy, when deciding what or who to follow?
Yes, we actually had some extra slides about legality and liability that I think we ended up cutting due to time. But if I understand the intent of the question, if you were to follow an AAP schedule, that I think is enough to say that that is the standard of care or that that is an agreed upon, standard within the medical community. So as far as like liability or being at risk or using a vaccine off label or something like that, that's something we cover in some of our other talks. So I don't currently believe physicians would be, or any provider would be at risk for that. If you're asking at a more global level, like how at maybe public health sites or healthcare systems should choose, I think that's institution specific. And our hope is that by putting out education like this, you have all the data, you have all the evidence, and that people, will choose to do what's best for their patients and their communities.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I'm going to end on, we have a couple of comments that were just put into the Q&A, just saying that this was an astounding education. No questions. Thank you for this fabulous presentation. So well done and important. So I will echo that. And I want to just say thank you again to everyone for coming. We know this was a very timely education. We're so thankful that you were able to join us. Please be on the lookout for the recording. It should be available in the next day or so, and feel free to share it with colleagues. And we'll have another educational opportunity at the end of January that you'll hopefully be able to join us at. So any closing thoughts, Tracy?
No, just thank everyone so much. There's clearly a strong interest in this, and CIRE will continue to put out timely information as best we can in this just ever-changing landscape. So we're all in this together. Thanks everyone for what you're doing on the front lines.
All right, sounds good. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.